Everywhere we turn, we see division. Everywhere we go, we feel alone. How do we live in a time that is so polarizing and isolating? How do we find meaning in a world filled with so much noise? Where is the understanding and empathy? Where is the freedom from our pain? Join me, Russell Eugene Welch III. This is our journey together as we discover that the answers to life's biggest questions and hardest choices are not some deep, mystical secret locked away in some far-off corner of the universe, but the soft, gentle voice in our own hearts. This is our first step, as together we embark on our incredible adventure of empathy, unity, and understanding. These are the stories of human triumph. Your stories, our stories. This is the struggle for meaning. Greetings and salutations. This is the struggle for meaning. I am your host, Russell Eugene Welch III. For our first proper interview on the show, we have a dear friend of mine, a law student, very mindful, passionate, patient individual who has a powerful story to share. Without further ado, I give you Caleb Betts. Hi, Caleb.
Hey, everyone. I don't know if that's what I was supposed to say or not, but
yes.
It seemed like the right time.
It seemed like the right time.
I'm a second-year law student, so I don't have much free time or much sanity.
Let's start with this question. Caleb, how would you describe your personal philosophy?
My personal philosophy. I would say my personal philosophy has a lot to do with seeking out fundamental truth. I mean, and I'm sure that sounds very generic and vague, but I feel like a lot of what I focus on is kind of the duty that I've been given as a human. And a lot of my philosophy on life comes down to what those duties are. And those duties could range from not just duties generally as a human, but my duty as a son, my duty as a brother, my duty as just a member of society in this country that I happen to be in. And I would say that kind of guides a lot of my decisions.
You said you're dedicated to the pursuit of fundamental truth. So what is fundamental truth, and why the fundamental, and what's the difference between truth and fundamental truth?
Yeah, well, I think fundamental truth to me has to do with kind of the root component to a thing, right? So for me, I think one of my highest values as a person is justice, right? And I think that word justice, there's a lot of different ideologies have kind of taken a stab at it. To some people, justice is simply punishing someone who does a bad thing. But to me, when I think of justice, and why I think you have to tie the fundamental into that, is because fundamental truth gets to the core of a thing. And I think just in my experiences in the world, I've seen a lot of wrongdoing. I've experienced a lot of hurt. I've perpetrated that hurt as well. And I don't think that there are easy, clear answers to those issues, right? I think anytime we experience pain in our lives, we're subjected to that pain, we receive it. Typically, you're going to be recreating that in your own interactions in the world, right? So to me, I feel like I've always had this curiosity of like, where did this kind of brokenness come from? And kind of the unfairness and the injustice of a lot of it seems to be that a lot of us are born into circumstances, or we receive hurt or brokenness in things that are completely out of our control. And so a lot of my pursuit of truth and my philosophy has been guided by kind of understanding that. Like, why do these things happen? And I think, I guess an a pithy way of saying it, well, why do bad things happen to good people? Because I think we've all been there.
So do you believe you've reached an answer to that question?
I think I've arrived at more questions. I think that, one thing I've just kind of, I think I've learned, and I'm still young and I still have a lot to learn, but one thing I've realized is that I think wisdom has a lot more to do with being comfortable with the questions around you than having a false sense of security like you have the answers to all of them, and that's something that I've personally had to go through, because I do like to have control of my understanding of the world. Something I've had to do throughout my life is kind of let go of a lot of those. I think let go of kind of needing to have clear, easy answers to those questions, but also being kind of comfortable with them and not complacent to the point where I'm not searching for truth anymore. Because I think it's a fine line. Because I think if you fool yourself into thinking you have every answer to every question, it becomes ideology. And, obviously ideology is kind of just viewing the world within a very set structure and a framework that helps you make sense of things, but also doesn't leave room for nuances,
Right. So it's just an easy shortcut.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for me personally, I grew up, in a Christian home. And when you grow up in a structure like that, it's very easy to kind of just be trained in the ideology and to not be trained in that pursuit of truth. And obviously when you're a child, it's hard to differentiate between the two.
Yeah.
As a child, you're receiving a lot of what you're given by your parents. And for me, I had two incredibly loving parents, and, they were both very committed Christians. But as I got older, I had to start kind of wrestling with, the inevitable questions you have growing up in the church, and then realizing that if I didn't make an effort to continually pursue truth, then I would just kind of receive an ideology that would kind of stifle that pursuit.
So what efforts did you take to ensure that you were pursuing truth and not just ingesting the ideology you were given?
So one of the biggest steps I took was actually, making the decision to go to a school that I knew was very hostile to that ideology. So I went to a school called Occidental College, which is a phenomenal school, and I'm so grateful that I went there. But I chose that school because I knew it would be a place where there's so many different ideas than the ones I was raised around.
So you wanted to expose yourself to new stuff and be challenged.
Exactly. And a lot of people, when I told them I was going to go to that school, told me I was crazy. They're like, are you kidding? Like, Occidental College, as someone who identifies as a Christian, you're going in there and you're just pretty much getting tossed into the fire. Like,
right.
You're going to be getting attacked here and there. But to me, I viewed it as more of like, well, I want this to be a refining experience. And if I'm not willing to expose myself to other ideas, and even more importantly, build deep friendships with people who held different ideas than me, then that seems like a cowardly thing to do and like a cowardly way to live life.
Right. Because the truth shouldn't be afraid of a challenge.
Exactly. And, and we've kind of talked about this before, but I really genuinely believe if you have a sincere pursuit of truth and you enter into friendships and relationships and go into circles that are going to be places where your idea of truth is challenged, I think it will serve as more of a refining experience for that pursuit, and not necessarily, you having to let go of every belief that you hold on to. But I think it also does require a level of self-awareness, and you need to really understand your tendencies. Because, like, for instance, if you have people-pleasing tendencies, like I did and I still do, then you just have to be aware of motivations where you might compromise on those beliefs that you do believe are true for the sake of fitting, which is a common thing.
What would be like an example of that in a situation that you might find yourself in?
I think anytime you are the minority in a setting or an environment, we all want to be accepted. And
right.
A lot of times, if you're not aware of that dynamic, then you could easily fool yourself into thinking, this seems like the more majority opinion, so I'm going to kind of compromise on this conviction because if I don't, I might get looked at kind of funny and I want to fit in.
Right.
Even though the thing that you might be compromising in is a conviction that is very genuine and sincere, and you've come to those conclusions in your journey up to that point, on your own. which is why for me, a really helpful practice is meditation. I try to meditate 3 times a day. And for me, it's so important because it kind of disconnects myself from people and influences around me and gives me that clarity and to think, what are my true motivations? When I'm in a room by myself, my truest desires and motivations should kind of rise to the surface. When you're just around people all the time, we're very sensitive to the convictions of other people and to their ideas of truth. And you can easily lose yourself.
So you're saying it's important to be able to take a step back and recognize what your own personal motivations are separate from any kind of group identity.
Exactly. And I think that's where like solitude comes in, where nowadays it's hard to find and experience true solitude because even if you're in a room by yourself, you have your smartphone with you and you have Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. And so literally you're fooling your consciousness into thinking that there's an audience still. For instance, when I step away to have solitude and meditate, I try to keep my phone as far away from me as possible because even just that proximity to like these fictions and this audience can really be a hindrance in getting that clarity.
What would you recommend to someone who wanted to implement this process of mindfulness, if this piqued their interest?
First thing I would say is just a word of caution. Like if you really, when you commit to incorporating solitude into your, daily routine, you can experience some pretty like scary things, by yourself. Because when everything is turned off and when all the music is muted and the social media is off and you're just alone with your thoughts, if there are things you're struggling with, right? Or if there are toxic mindsets or internal voices you're listening to, you're going to hear those a lot clearer. And so I always say, just be aware of that. Because I think the first time I really started to incorporate solitude and meditation and prayer in my routine, I actually had some pretty bad anxiety would come up because it's like just a subconscious thing, having to really face those fears that you can kind of keep putting off when you're just in the constant go. It can be a pretty scary thing. So
to be alone with yourself.
Yeah. So you just got to kind of be aware of, what are things you struggle with in the past. If you deal with severe anxiety, for instance, just, be aware of that and maybe set a timer where if you start feeling those things, you just got to be ready for them to rise up because they will.
What is the actual practice of self-examination here that you go through, that you implement to examine your own motives?
Yeah, I think honesty is the most important thing. I think carry a lot of guilt and shame with us, just regardless of what your life experiences are. I think, we've all done things that we're not proud of, or we've experienced things that cause us that shame. And so when you step into a space of like solitude and meditation, you need to just kind of surrender those things. I think this is also where it really depends on your own convictions and your beliefs. For me personally, I am still a very spiritual person, and a lot of my beliefs and deepest convictions are still rooted in the teachings of Christ. Something that Christ specifically did was practice solitude and prayer. So the key for me personally is you can go into solitude and all these things are going to come up. Maybe anxiety or fear or traumatic memories. But unless you're able to kind of offload those things and let them go, it's really a fruitless endeavor. Mindfulness, in my opinion.
Because you're just trapping yourself in your negative experiences, right?
Yeah, because you'll get clarity, but what is the point of getting clarity on a, really traumatic experience in terms of, the emotions attached to it or the memory if you don't really have a way to treat it, right?
Right.
It'd be like if you had a rotting wound in your arm and you've been taking kind of painkillers for a while, but it's still infected. And then you just went off the painkillers. You have clarity now. You can feel the burning sensation in your arm, but unless you do something about it, nothing's going to happen. At least this is kind of just from my own personal experience with it.
Now that we've established your approach to the world and kind of where you're coming from and your goals, let's talk a little bit about your theology. What would you summarize your personal theology as?
I would say my personal theology is rooted in four problems. And those 4 problems would be lies, fear, guilt, and shame. And now those 4 things, in my experience, are kind of some of the four most prominent evils in our experience as humans. In some ways, it's a cycle, right? In some ways, we experience or receive lies in our lives, and those lies plant fear, and that fear leads to behavior that leads to guilt, and that guilt leads to shame, and then that shame leads to lies, and it just kind of continues. And so my personal theology has a lot to do with eradicating those four evils. Really, the solution that I found in walking and having to address all those things myself is you've got to surrender those things, something or someone. And I found that through Jesus and the teachings, but I think specifically how those teachings and his teachings countered the ideology that Christianity has become today. I definitely understand that when people hear that word Jesus, or they hear someone that, they said they follow Jesus' teaching, there's a lot of negative association.
For some people,
and for some people. And I think mainly because people attach the teachings of Christ to things that people have done in the name of ideology, in the name of Christianity. All that to say, in my personal experience, a lot of it has come down to focusing on Jesus Christ. What were his teachings? What are his teachings today? And how does he address those four kind of evils that I mentioned?
Thank you. So obviously you've outlined that you're a Christian. Would you consider yourself like a fundamentalist Christian?
I would consider myself a Christian as in the original sense of the term. The original sense of the term was actually, little Christ.
Right.
So Christ follower.
Personally, I'm an atheist. That's where I'm coming from. I grew up in a Christian home, and I used to be Christian, and I'm obviously no longer. The relevance of sharing that is not because it's relevant to the content of the show, specifically that I'm an atheist, but it's relevant to demonstrating this point and why I had Caleb here on the show. We're going to talk about the importance of communicating and how to communicate when two people are coming from a radically different place, because everywhere around us we see this extremely toxic and unhealthy dynamic of an us versus them polarizing, where if someone believes and thinks differently, you have to go after the fact that they believe and think differently and target that. And it's not constructive. It's harmful. It doesn't produce better results. It doesn't forward your position or your ideology or your philosophy. You just create enemies of it. And you create enemies of yourself, and you bruise people's feelings and bruise people's prides and frustrate yourself. So, Caleb, as someone who is friends with an atheist, what would you say are some of the things that you keep in mind, that you practice, that you think of, that are important to you, that affect how you communicate with me?
Speaking like as a Christian specifically?
Yeah, as a Christian who's speaking to an atheist, what are the things that go through your mind when you are speaking to me about those things? Because you've never said anything that's made me feel attacked or belittled. You've never made me feel like I'm stupid for thinking differently than you. So obviously that's a very helpful, healthy, constructive dynamic, because I feel acknowledged and appreciated as a person. But what is it that you are doing in your mind that produces that result?
Yeah, first of all, thank you. I've always appreciated this friendship and, just who you are and what your gifts are. And I think like that is probably the most important part, is I've just learned that, we're all on different journeys and we're all seeking the same thing. We're all searching for truth. And I think just anytime I'm talking to anybody, but I guess in particular, someone who maybe identifies as an atheist, I just try to listen and learn. I really do believe that everybody has something to teach me. And I think that kind of approach where you take the posture of listening and receiving, it's given me a lot of clarity on my own journey. In my personal belief, I really do believe that God has a lot to teach me still about the world and about justice and about the value in other people and in myself. And so most of my life has really just been trying to listen. And I think a lot of that just comes from just growing up. A lot of my closest friends, we've just been on the same journey, but it's taken us down different paths. A lot of my closest friends identify as atheists just because we've always had that trust and that type of relationship, I've realized that again, like I always have something that I can learn from someone else. So I know it's not really I would say, a lot of Christians kind of try to take like an aggressive stance, or like if they feel like someone's ideology threatens theirs, they like try to actively debate and argue, but I've never really found that very fruitful in my own journey.
So you're basically saying the core principle here is to listen and try to gain value from someone instead of trying to change them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think just even speaking as a Christian, a lot of time, I mentioned kind of how I like to control things. And one thing I had to learn early in my life and in my journey is that the more I try to control things, sometimes the more I kind of get in the way of what God might be speaking to me about. And so in a lot of ways, when I just get to enjoy friendships with people who have fundamentally different views than me, and I get to see just how valuable they are and how valuable their gifts are in terms of the curiosity for the world. And especially when you pair that with the sincerity of a pursuit to find truth, there's so much that we have in common in terms of, my atheist friends. And I think it just creates space because it humbles me and it makes me realize that I too am still a student of truth in the world. I believe that there's something divine in every human, every person. And so there is something to learn in every conversation.
Now, do you think taking that approach makes people more open to your ideology and philosophy?
Maybe, but that's not really ever the goal when I meet someone. And like we've always said, right? When you're seeking truth and it's a genuine pursuit and you have deep friendships and you invest in relationships with people different than you, you will have clarity into beliefs and ideas that aren't true. And I've personally received a lot of clarity in terms of having to address biases in myself or pride. It's almost like the more that I grow in friendships with people who believe fundamentally different things than me, the more I can be comfortable and accept the mysteries of the world. And, in my personal experience, the mysteries of God, and kind of just sit with questions instead of trying to come up with answers and convince other people of those answers. Just invite people into curiosity with me, because I believe that just me as a person am very limited at a fundamental level. And I would much rather just experience that journey with other people than try to force people into what I perceive to be true at that time.
So it sounds like you're very comfortable with being around people who are radically different than you.
Absolutely. I think I've had to learn that. So the world I grew up in was much more politically conservative, an area called Orange County, south of LA. And it's kind of like a little bastion of just more conservative political thought. And so then when I went to Occidental College, which is in Los Angeles, which is like the big liberal city from people's perspective here in Orange County.
Right.
And then I go to this school that is even more far left on the ideological spectrum than the city itself. I ended up having people in my dorm, classmates who literally everything that they believed about the world fundamentally was the antithesis of what I believed at the time.
Was that a shock at first?
Well, it was, because part of me was like, wow, like these are really genuinely good, nice people. These are people who are really having a genuine pursuit of truth, and they want to help their communities. They want to serve their families. They want to love their families. They want to make a positive impact on the world. And it scared me at first because it caused me to question a lot of the things that I was taught. It started to kind of poke holes in my ideological bubble that I believed I would be safe within entering that environment.
What would be some examples of some holes that were poked?
So I think, let's see, one example would be when you grow up in a very politically conservative area, you're taught that anyone on the left or who identifies as a liberal is really just out. And this might be like an extreme position, but this is something I did hear a lot growing up, is that anybody who's liberal is just completely out of touch with reality. They are just concerned about tearing things down and not building things up. They have no moral compass whatsoever. So they kind of just drift around. All these things that, like, just growing up you hear, in the world that I grew up in. And then I get there and I meet a lot of people who self-identify as like a leftist radical. Like they would just own that term. But, they're principled people, right? And they're easy to talk with. you just sit down and find that you have a lot more in common in terms of your pursuits. I mean, it was just like jumping in the cold water.
Now, did meeting these people, did that change your political or philosophical or theological position on anything? Or did it just make you open to these people? Like, what kind of effect did that have on your mindset?
Well, so I think one of the most compelling things that I learned while at Oxy and just with the people I was around was a healthy level of skepticism for things that exist.
Right.
And I think I just never really that muscle was never really trained in terms of questioning things. Now, I believe that there's a healthy balance, right? I think that if you just question everything, then you find yourself tearing down every conceivable structure and you have no real direction. But what it did teach me was it taught me to look at LA, look at the city, look at the country and say, you know what, there are systems in place or there are ideas or ideologies that are actually really unhealthy and really destructive. And then what it did was then that kind of trickled into my religion and my faith. And that I think was scarier than just seeing the political world that I grew up in through a critical lens. Then I started to really think about Christianity. And that was a scary thing because I set down the magnifying glass for a while and be like, is this something I want to do? Do I really want to start thinking critically about Christianity? Because like it's kind of like Matrix, like which pill am I going to take? I can take one pill and just forget all this, or I can go down this rabbit trail that I might not come out of.
And which pill did you take?
I took the pill to go deeper and to really start being critical.
And what did you find?
A lot more truth. So it wasn't a smooth journey because it started as a lot of resentment. It started as taking a lot of what I was told, really just a crash course in all the horrible things that have been done in the name of Christianity. And that was a tough pill to swallow. That pill was about the size of a watermelon.
Right.
And that was hard because I had to go home for, spring break and stuff. And I just had to look people in the eyes who I was questioning all the time. Do they understand the history of Christianity in America? Or do they know these atrocities that were committed or this and that? So that was a really hard chapter.
Did that feel pretty isolating?
It did in one way, coming back home and seeing friends that you grow up with. And, they're not necessarily asking the same questions, but I did find a really healthy community of other kind of, I guess you could say, like critical Christians on campus. It's cool because in that environment, because you're really the minority, there's kind of a cost to even associating with a group of Christians at Oxy. You can't be wishy-washy about your faith. Like, if you identify in any way in that environment, you're going to just be looked at differently.
So there was some judgment there for that. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's really just kind of a test. Like, okay, why do you walk with these beliefs? Because now you're not in the majority anymore. I'm not back home in Orange County or doing all the quote unquote right things. There's a cost to my beliefs now.
So going from being in the majority, being a comfortable majority where not too many things were questioned, and then being in a minority where you were questioning all of these things and where you had pressure on you, social pressure, intellectual pressure. How did that affect you? How did that feel?
It wasn't comfortable. Like, it was painful most of the time because I didn't understand at the beginning how to have a healthy level of criticism, but also still have like a foundation to stand on, like it felt like I was kind of picking apart the bricks of the foundation that I was standing on. And I'm like, well, I'm about to just collapse at this point. Like, what is there left? But that was the reason I wanted to enter that environment. I had to just have this faith that if there is something fundamentally true about these beliefs that I was raised in, but there may be some wrong ideology that has kind of crept in throughout the years, I have to believe that greater truth is going to remain at the end of that kind of purge, Like, I just had to step in the fire and be like, look, there are things I fundamentally believe are true, but if I'm not willing to step into this environment where I know I'm going to have to go through the fire and maybe let go of some things that are not connected to that fundamental truth, then I'm just going to live my whole life with doubt, but be comfortable.
So you stepped into the fire, and what came out the other side?
So, a lot. And it's hard. The journey was so dynamic, and I'm still on the journey. It's not like just because I've graduated college, like now I'm out of it. Now as a law student, I'm in a space, a very intellectually rigorous space where, not many people around me hold the same beliefs and values that I do. It's college all over again, but kind of the next level. What I think I did walk away from Oxy with was a lot of confidence, but at the same time, like a lot of humility.
Right. Which those things can easily coexist. Like they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, that's funny. I mean, people usually think confidence and humility are antithetical, but they're actually, when they're healthy, they're together.
Right.
Because now, like after walking through Oxy in those 4 years and really just letting everything go in a sense, or being willing to let everything go, the truths that I received back in terms of, what it means to search for truth, who Jesus really is. That was the big one, right? Like I found myself in Skid Row talking with people who had lived through terrible experiences. I had to kind of sit there and see all this injustice and face that tough question, where is God in this? I had to read history about global tragedies and abuses of power in the name of God and confront those painful questions. Where is God in this? It really was an experience. I had to let go of so many things, right? But then again, the confidence and the humility I came out with was really a humility that I'm one man in one generation, of one people group. Well, a few people group, but, in one country. And I also got to see a lot of good. I don't know. It's tough.
So could you outline for us the difference between, so you were a Christian when you went in, and you had come from a more like fundamentalist conservative background. What were the changes, and what changed when you came out the other side, and what stayed the same?
So some things that changed was I realized that a true, genuine, search for truth takes a lot of risk. And that's really what faith is. Growing up, I always thought faith was just believing in a God that I couldn't see or couldn't hear from. And I thought that faith was listening to things about God and just believing that they're true. Faith is taking people at their word and silencing the inevitable questions, because questioning things was a lack of faith. That's kind of what I grew up in. That's what I came into Oxy with. What I left with was actually faith had seemingly actually led me to that space, because as I was in college and as I had to wrestle with these painful questions and I had to be comfortable with uncertainty, faith became, I need to let go of a lot of things that I was given that were not truly of God. And even if those are things that made me very comfortable. And so my kind of definition of faith and my experience of faith completely changed. I think one thing that stayed the same through college was kind of my reliance on scripture. And so that book, biblical scripture, that really stayed with me. I came into college holding a book that, I'd been given just by my family, and that I was familiar with the narrative, but it was really kind of just a tool to distract myself from the world. But as I was kind of in the fire and as I really had to wrestle with these questions, the Bible, it really specifically who Jesus is and who he was and who he continues to be, that is something that just gave me even more clarity. So I would say the most consistent thing is just my access to my Bible, even though I had a love-hate relationship with it a lot of times, because I would read something and be like, this is just ridiculous, or I would receive something or a teaching from school and then look at it and be like, what does this mean? This is so confusing. But it was always there. It was just always there, and it still is there.
So it definitely seems like not only did you intentionally put yourself in a situation in which you could be challenged, but you continuously made the choice as you were challenged over the years to take every single challenge as an opportunity to grow and push yourself to become a more grounded, mature, level-headed, open-minded person.
Yeah, exactly. And just being willing to let go. Because if you're not willing to let go, and when I say let go, that doesn't mean you just reject the beliefs you have, but let go is in let go of control. and place yourself around people who you know are going to have really tough questions that you don't have answers to. If you're not willing to do that, then it reveals a certain lack of faith you have in your own belief. And that's why I think it's hard for a lot of people to communicate with people who are fundamentally different than them. It's because it makes them feel vulnerable. When you have to sit down and look someone else in the eyes and realize that they're human too, and that they're the same makeup as you, that they are human, and that they also went through rough things, but they've come to completely different conclusions. That is the most scary thing I think you'll ever have to face in your life.
Is the acknowledgement that just because someone believes differently than you doesn't mean that they don't have good reasons.
Absolutely. And then the scary part about having to really listen and wrestle with their logic and walk away from that conversation with more questions than you had answers.
Does someone else having valid reasons for believing differently than you have a positive, negative, benign, or mute connection to what the truth actually is and to what you believe? Like, does somebody else having valid reasons for believing something different mean that you should or need to change what you believe?
It's a good question.
I think that's the question that makes a lot of people uncomfortable with facing that situation, because it's a tough question to wrestle with.
It is. And sometimes I found that it's best to just sit with a question for a while. But a personal experience of mine has been sitting down with someone. So for instance, I used to do some work on Skid Row, and a big reason that a lot of us, went down there, and this is just a group of friends who, weren't called as Christians, but we all had different worldviews, but we just wanted to serve people. It was this universal belief that people on Skid Row, and just for context, Skid Row is the largest stable population of homeless individuals in the country, within a square mile. So it's an area in downtown that's just really dense with encampments, and it feels like another country. So we went down there, just a group of friends, a bunch of different ideologies and worldviews, but we wanted to just go to serve people because we really wanted to learn from people down there. And some of the hardest moments I had in my journey was, I can wrestle with intellectual debate. But the most challenging thing for me was sitting down and listening to someone's story and hearing nothing but misfortune, to the point where that pain and that wrongness led them to this just completely miserable state, and having to confront that daunting question, where is God? What is God doing? That to me was scarier than sitting down with any, other student or professor who had a different fundamental view than me and receiving questions from them. That was hard because that got to the core of my belief. If I believe that there is an active, present, loving God, how do I make sense of all this stuff? That was the scariest moment for me.
And in confronting that scary moment, what resulted from that? How did that affect your mindset, and what conclusion did you walk away from that with?
So, I think the comfortable answer or conclusion a lot of, well-meaning Christians may try to come to is, the story's complicated, and they ended up there by their own doing. But when you really get down there and you sit down in the dirt and you just listen to real humans and their stories, a lot of times it's not that clear cut, a lot of times it's complicated in the opposite way, where they did everything right, but they still ended up here. So it was hard. What am I supposed to do with that? And that's what forced me to just kind of stop and shut up and just listen and learn from people. I kind of went in some ways to Skid Row with this prideful mentality of I'm just going to kind of go in and try to do good. Or, subconsciously I was like, I'll be a good person, help these poor, unfortunate individuals. Maybe in so doing, they will see the light, all these hidden egotistical motives. And then I go there and it's literally just crippling, in terms of wow, I don't even know how to process. And that really was important for my journey because it forced me to kind of humble myself and shut up. I guess that's sometimes really bad things happen to really good people, and there's mystery to that. And for me to be so prideful is to think I can just come up with an easy solution while people are dying in the streets, around the world, that's a terrible mindset to have.
Right. So in regards to the scary question of where is God in that instance, what conclusion did you come to, or are you still working on that question?
So I'll just tell a story, actually. after I graduated from college, I worked at a law firm down on Skid Row called Inner City Law Center. And they do a lot of kind of pro bono legal work with like families that need legal services that can't afford it, or if you're homeless and you're entitled to benefits or something, we help them out with it. And the first day I was walking to the firm, and you have to walk pretty much through Skid Row, and there's this one older woman sitting down on the sidewalk, and she was just jotting something. She was scribbling something really frantically on the sidewalk. And I kind of saw it. I tried to look at what she was writing, and I couldn't really make it out. So I just kept walking. So I get to the firm, and I'm meeting everyone, and I'm on my lunch break, and I just can't get that image of this old woman sitting on trash bags, jotting something down on chalk on the sidewalk. Like something she kept popping up in my mind. So I was like, I have to go meet this woman. Like I need to go talk with her. And so I grabbed like a couple slices of pizza or something that the office provided and some soda, and like went out there, and I walked up to her, and she was sitting there smiling, like a huge, big old smile. And I was like, oh, hi. Like, I walked up to her and I kind of introduced myself, and I was like, oh, I'm just, I'm working right here. And she's like, oh man, like, what's your name? It's the most joyful, radiant person I've ever met in my life. And I was like, oh, my name's Caleb. And she was like, and she just kind of shook her head. She's like, Caleb. Like, Caleb and Joshua, they entered the land of giants, and they were not afraid to claim God's promises. And I was like, what? Like, where did that come from? And I looked down, and what she's writing down is the Beatitudes, which is from Scripture, which a lot of people have heard, like, blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the kingdom of heaven, all these kind of blessings, and then also rebukes. And we sit down, and we just have this, like, hour-long conversation, and it's just the most lovely time. And her name is Marlene, and that started a friendship that has continued to this day. And she actually, every other day, we would sit down and talk together, and she became like a mentor to me, gospel to me, and encouraging me after I'd have a long day at work. I'm like, here I am, in this suit and tie, working at this firm, feeling like perspective, just doing every right thing, but I'm coming to her for answers. And here she is, this, homeless woman who is literally just living on the street, surrounded by trash bags, but with the most genuine joy and radiant smile. And so that whole chapter of my life, I went to her with a lot of my spiritual questions, and she gave me a lot of really clear answers. And so you can kind of see the irony in all of it, where, I kind of went to that environment, that world, trying to, thinking, oh, maybe I can offer some kind of clarity, to like other people. And then I ended up being mentored and taught by an incredibly enlightened and loving and joyful person. I think that, that story, it's a story that I always think about, and she's a friend that I always think about. And I feel like that kind of hopefully, answers that question.
So that was a pretty powerful experience for you.
It was. And I ended up continuing. So even after my internship at that firm ended, I would still go back just to check in on her. And she was always there, just, praying, writing scripture on the sidewalk. And I always just felt like this spiritual clarity walking away from her. That was a very life-changing friendship for me, because her friendship and sitting down with someone who, again, initially, I had no idea who she was. I didn't know what her experiences were. And in a lot of ways, seeing her even still scared me initially, because I had to look at a woman on the street, homeless, and face that, terrifying reality that, like, I'm trying to serve an all-powerful, all-loving God, but there's someone here on the sidewalk. But then almost in a lot of ways, meeting and engaging with God through the love that she showed me and through the advice that she gave. And that changed a lot of things for my journey. And it changed the way I viewed Christ. It changed the way I viewed things like poverty and wealth, justice, injustice. And it was, if anything, the most huge thing I walked away with was humility. Like, wow. I have so much to learn, and I have a lot to repent of in terms of, my complacency with the state of other people, and not just people on the streets, right? Like the state of my own soul and the pride that I carried my whole life towards people different than me. That was as unjust in God's eyes as was being complacent with someone on the streets. Like that was as destructive to other people in terms of the resentment and hate that I carried through that prideful mindset as it would be if I, kicked someone out of their home. So it gave me a lot of clarity, but also more questions, right? Which is funny. Like, I feel like every time I got more clarity, I would get more questions.
Did that answer the question for you of where was God when all these things happened to these people?
It did. But there are also still questions that exist. I don't think there's a clean answer that's going to please everyone in terms of why there is any kind of suffering in the world.
Is there an answer that pleases you?
Yeah.
Would you mind sharing that?
One answer is, yeah. I think one answer is there's a lot of irony in the fact that, I've worked in my lifetime around some of the most powerful, successful people in my limited circle. I worked in D.C. my junior year of college. I've worked in the D.C. Attorney General's office. So I've been around people who have close proximity to power. So I've seen that. And a lot of those people, there are many people in that world of D.C., which again is the closest proximity to some of the highest power in the world, who are the most miserable, terrified, unjoyful people I've ever met in my life. I'm not referring specifically to like my coworkers or to, the people in the offices I work with. I'm just saying in general, when you're in that world, you meet people who've made it, but you see insight into their experiences. It was shocking. It was discouraging for me. I was like, wait, that's where I want to be in 10 years. But if that's where I'm going to end up, what's the point? And again, that's a generalization. It's definitely not saying that, everyone who makes it is going to be miserable, but I saw a lot of that. And so then to go from that and then to sit in some of the most impoverished communities and meet people who seem to be so filled with joy and peace, and I would say authority in terms of understanding some of the deepest mysteries of the world. It gave me pause. It gave me reason to pause and to think and to evaluate how I viewed suffering and what true suffering and deepest suffering can look like. Now, that doesn't mean that we become complacent in issues of poverty. And that also doesn't mean that there are just some very genuinely tragic stories that I still don't have answers to, because I have plenty of those. But I think what it did cause me to do it gave me questions to ask about what is my goal as a person and what ought to be our goal in terms of humanity and how we measure success and prosperity.
So obviously the easy shortcut for people like me or you or people on the right or the left or of one ideology or another is to focus on our differences and say, well, you believe this and I think that you believe that's ridiculous, or you believe this and I think that your belief is harmful. But what is the way in which someone who is like people like us who have radically different backgrounds, what is the process by which we go about working together and finding common ground? I think people have the shared goal of they want to make the world a better place. We don't want the world to be a shithole. So how do we go about in our shared world, even though we're so radically different, working together?
I mean, I think a lot of it starts with just building trust. If we don't have trust in any kind of friendship or relationship, you're not really going to get much meaningful communication. Without trust, communication is literally just me giving my idea or my viewpoint, anticipating what your response will be, and then you countering that viewpoint or doing the same thing, right? Because if there's no trust, there's no belief that you genuinely are seeking truth and you genuinely want my good and the good of society and the good of yourself. So I feel like a first step is really just build proximity and build trust. Sit in a room with people who believe fundamentally different things than you, but don't even start on that. Start on something you have in common. And one of those most prominent shared experiences is experiences of pain. And I think that no matter who you are, in terms of what you believe, we've all experienced pain in some capacity. So I think connecting on that level is really important.
Right. I mean, the easy pitfall to fall into is to see what your differences are in ideology or belief and then go after someone's differences to try to fix them. That's such an easy pitfall to go into. But I think the way more important step to take is, like you said, to build that trust. And then when you have that trust is to then go to the person instead of going after what they think differently than you. Ask them why they think differently. Try to figure out what their motives are. Because talking to you, I've never felt like there was going to be a point in which you were in opposition to me. Like, I've never felt like you were in opposition to me, even though the fact that you have very different political and especially very, very different theological views of the world, but I never felt like you were in opposition to me, because I could always look at you and I could see that you had a shared priority to help people and take care of them in personal growth and to make the world a better place. And so because I understood that we had that shared priority, I couldn't care less whether you're like a Buddhist or a Jainist or a Muslim or believe in Thor. Like, why would I care? As long as we have the shared priority of making our world a better place and coexisting in a constructive way and growing as people. To me, that means that there isn't a real opposition there. It's a perceived opposition of you think differently than me and you see the world differently than me. But I think that it's a mirage that it's so easy to get stuck up on and see of just like, oh, they think differently than me like this. But if you can really step past that and get to the person behind it, then you can get to your shared motives. And hopefully there are shared motives that you can find that really bring people together. Maybe you don't find shared motives, but until you step past the surface level, easy to go for gunning political or theological or anything else, veil that's in front of the person and really get to their motives behind it, then you can't have a productive interaction with them. And many times, even though you have a radically different veil in front, if you can get past that and you both realize you have a shared commonality, a shared goal, shared priorities, the priorities of making the world a better place and helping people. And if we can set aside that veil in front of both of us, that mask that we wear of the easy to recognize labels of this policy or this position or that position, and we step up outside of those curtains and we really recognize who people are behind that, and we can have a conversation with each other about how do we make this constructive thing come to light? How do we produce better results together? Whether that's changing the world or changing our country or changing our economy or changing our locally or even just changing as people or just having a healthy, respective, constructive relationship between two people. You can take that can happen on any scale.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think you hit the nail on the head just with that entire,
right.
And I think like that is it. I think that at everyone's core, there are things that connect us that transcend ideology or belief. My belief is that we're all born with an inherent sense of values, just fairness and justice and righting wrong and loving our neighbor. These are things that we carry with us. And so you can tap into those things no matter who you're talking to. But exactly like to your point, right? A lot of people, they feel like someone is fundamentally different because of fundamentally different beliefs. But that is just a lie, kind of the mirage of ideology.
Right. Because like the easy thing for like when you say we have that, I'm assuming you would say that we have that underlying motive and it comes from God because God gave it to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in my belief, we're made in the image of God, Imago Dei, which means that doesn't just mean, oh, hey, we look like God or something. It means that the way we perceive the world and the way we understand right and wrong, it's instilled within all of us, And so that kind of helps me connect with people because I can hang on to that belief and be like, you know what? Someone I may be talking to might have fundamentally different conclusions about the world than I do. But I believe that we can still connect in a way that transcends that. And maybe we'll both get answers on our journey, you know? And that's always it. It's never, I find that the perspective, no matter who you are, what belief system you hold, if your view is always, I'm going to try to walk out there and try to convince somebody else of what I believe to be true, I feel like you're going to get nowhere because that just kind of rises to the surface in your interactions with other people. You don't even have to say it. You give off an energy of like, wow, this person is like viewing me as a project. Or this person is like not genuinely curious about my experiences or what I've seen in the world, And it goes both ways, whoever you are.
Yeah.
But I think when you really
the person
commit,
isn't listening to understand, they're listening to attack.
Exactly. Or like listening, like trying to gather ammo or ammunition, like a lawyer or something, like getting ready to pounce, like an evil lawyer.
Right.
So I don't know any of those.
To unpack that analogy a little bit more and draw a correlation, and the reason why I asked you to clarify that point, would you say it's a fair representation of what you believe to say that we have those priorities because God gave them to us. We have the priorities of wanting to live together in peace and love and harmony and be good people because God gave us that drive.
Yeah, I believe everything has a design to it. I also do think, though, that a lot of us, we go through experiences, and even just we're by virtue of being born into a broken world, you know, into kind of just seemingly tossed into circumstances that we have no control over. You know, I don't care who you are. No one can say or take any kind of ownership of the situation they're born into. Like, nobody. So what's the fairness in that? You know, that was a big question I had to wrestle with, and I still do. It's a lot of the things and experiences I've had, for the better, for the worse, is by virtue of where I've been born, and I have no control over that. So how can I take ownership of necessarily all the good things I've done? Or how can I look at someone else who was born in different circumstances and say, wow, you know, they really messed up, or like, wow, I'm glad I'm not fundamentally the person they are. You know, like it should complicate that experience. It should make it really uncomfortable to think about.
The veil there would be easy to get caught up is that you say, we have a natural drive to want to help people and do good and make the world a better place because God gave it to us. And like me as a secular atheist, I would say that with that drive comes from the fact that we as a species evolved with the traits of empathy and reciprocity because those were important traits that we needed to function as a social species. And that would be an example of the veil, the curtain in front of who we are and our motive. And I could say, well, no, there's all this evidence for evolution and you're like denying it and whatever. But that's not important. And that doesn't matter to the bigger conversation. If that's an academic conversation we're having, that's an academic conversation we're having. But any kind of attacks that you could make or I could make on that veil isn't really constructive because it's not addressing what the underlying factor is here. Because if I step out from behind that curtain and you step out from behind that curtain and we're standing there, then what we see is the fact that regardless of whether I'm saying we evolved with the traits of reciprocity and empathy and you're saying God gave us a natural desire to try to do these things, the underlying factor that we both agree on is that we have a fundamental drive to try to help people and make the world a better place. And we both agree on that. And that's the important commonality of motive. And we don't need to agree where that comes from to say, we both want the world to be a better place. We both want to help people. How do we do that together? Even while we have this curtain in front of us, this flavor text of what we believe and how we perceive the world. But that flavor text of how we perceive the world doesn't need to make us enemies and make us fight, because we can step out from behind that curtain and look at the underlying core motives and values that we share, and then work together toward a common goal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I love that, because when you kind of step behind the curtain, if we just have interactions based on like attacking perceived beliefs of the other person, we're not even engaging the other individual. And it's almost like our different conclusions, it's the starting point of a lifelong journey, where my deepest hope always for friendships is that they truly are lifelong and they last a long time, because we get to kind of just walk on that journey together. And in a lot of ways, you're rarely going to be convinced or compelled to completely flip your ideology based on another person. It's rare. I've never seen it happen, whoever you are, or whatever you believe like. But I have seen that when you have enough trust to walk with someone and alongside someone, and you have completely different beliefs, but you're comfortable enough to confide in that person and to, ask questions with the intention of learning for your own journey, it just changes the whole dynamic.
Yeah.
And I feel like the most productive friendships between people who, have completely different beliefs in the world, they're not just one and done interactions. Because when it's a one and done, have a sparring match with someone else's ideology and then just walk away, you didn't really learn anything. If anything, you kind of flexed your muscles a little bit, but there's no room for the ambiguity and the complexities of the world. I kind of mentioned it earlier, but I think the one thing that every single person has in common that people can connect on right away is a shared brokenness. And not like a brokenness of, maybe the way Christians describe it, like, he's born into the world like broken or something, but a brokenness in that we've experienced things, or we've seen things, or we've been hurt by things, and you've lived your life and you've never been hurt by something, then it's, wow, that's like a miracle. I don't think I've ever met someone like that. But that is something that people need to connect with at the deepest level. It's kind of our shared pursuit of having to address where we've been, the path we've walked on, or the path tossed to us. And I think that's really important.
Absolutely, because we live in such a radicalized and polarized society. And I think the world's always been radical and polarized. I don't think the trap of being like, oh, like it's worse than it's ever been. Now, we're just living in this part, so we're experiencing it firsthand as opposed to hearing vague things about other chapters of history. But I don't think that there's anything massively radically different other than the fact that we have access to so much technology and communication now that we just have access to more of this information so we can really see it on a larger scale instead of just the micro scale of our personal lives.
Absolutely. And again, more of those kind of just one and done engagements with other people and their views. Because social media is literally just that. It's very superficial. Everyone kind of standing on their own platform, shouting what they want to shout, and then maybe getting some feedback. But if you get any kind of critical feedback in the form of a comment, it just starts, unless they're a good friend, and that's not usually what I find the best, most constructive place to have those conversations. Right. It just quickly turns into like a war, or some like passerby will see it and be like, oh, I want some of that. And they'll like jump in and just try to choose someone to support. It just becomes very chaotic.
So how do we use social media to avoid that problem and not fall into that trap?
Ooh, I wish I knew. Right now, I mean, recently it's become kind of just stay away from it for a little bit, and also just talk with people who I have established like very trusting relationships with about these issues. I've never really posted something on Facebook where I just put all my beliefs out there in a way that is challenging someone. I typically just try to share stories. I found that those are the most helpful. Hopefully someone hears a story, either a story of mine or a story of someone I care about, that kind of has been a key part of my journey of truth. I do really just hope that someone is encouraged by the story, either because they have a different ideology or worldview than me, and they see the story and they're encouraged that people exist on the other side that can just kind of sit down and talk. It might be something I still need to work on in terms of like being bold or like confronting other worldviews, but I just find that those are impossible to do well when it's just text, because there's just so many cues and inflections and tone, and there's so much more to communication than just the words. And I think people tend to hear tone how they want to perceive it. So if you're saying something that they fundamentally disagree with, they're going to hear it in a really aggressive tone, and then it just kind of shuts them down early to where you're not going to get anywhere.
I think stories are a great tool. I wouldn't say they're the only tool, and I would say there are instances in which it is appropriate to confront something head on, but it's far less often than people use it for. It's a very selective tool that should be used very carefully, but we have a tendency to use it as our only tool and just go to every time. But stories are great. Glad you brought that up. It's very powerful because it does several things. One, it allows someone a window into your perspective that they can understand and empathize with. It provides them an opportunity to really see it instead of just hear it and reject it. And two, it does it in a way that isn't inherently, though depending on the story it could be, but isn't inherently an attack on what they think. So like an example would be if you just share a post that says you should be wearing a mask, you're a bad person if you're not wearing a mask. This makes fun of you if you're not wearing a mask. Ha ha ha. No statement on whether or not someone should be wearing a mask, because that's a different conversation that would need to be had in its entirety on its own. But just to use the example, like sharing something like that is a confrontation of the people who aren't wearing a mask. And so they're going to feel confronted and attacked, and so their guard's immediately going to go up. And then they're not going to hear, and they're not going to think about it. But like a story that explains it allows someone to, without having their beliefs inherently and automatically attacked, experience and understand the other perspective and hear it and empathize with it in a way that they can internalize and process and really think about. And I think that really brings the human element to it, because if we can share stories on both sides, then it provides people the opportunity to understand and empathize with and see where other people are coming from, and then really evaluate the difference and then make a well-informed decision about what they want to choose, instead of just choosing the side that they're already on because it's being attacked and challenged, and so they're just putting their guard up and defending what they believe.
Absolutely. And I think like even stories are generally pretty like intimate things too, especially if the story has to do with your own experiences or someone who you're close to. A story is an invitation. You're literally inviting other people into your life. And I think there is something disarming about a story because it changes the posture of the listener. Literally, like if someone came up to you and just started sharing a story, like you're not going to necessarily be as inclined to like be really critical about the details. You're not going to be like, oh wait, you're walking down 8th Street? Are you sure? You sure it wasn't 7th Street? I just imagine, like people sitting around like a campfire or something. Your guard is down and you're receiving. And it's cool because like you said, then the person's lived experiences or maybe what they've found to be true in their journey so far, everyone gets kind of benefit from that. Stories have always been compelling for me personally, especially when I've learned a lot from people with different worldviews than me, because you can't really reject a story as easily as you could reject like an argument.
Right.
I think we're just something about us, who we are as humans. We're very drawn to stories. Stories compel us at a really deeper level.
It is a bit of a double-edged sword because there is an edge on the other side of stories, is that they can have a tendency to be very anecdotal and very subjective and very open to being manipulated to present a certain side or paint something in a certain light. There's no perfect median. It's an extremely helpful and useful and powerful tool, but it's not the only tool we have. But it's also a tool that it's super empowering for both sides to use it, and it's super important for both sides to use it. But it's also important for us to recognize it for what it is and take a step back and view that objectively, which is the thing that we should always be doing anyway, but we're usually not.
Yeah. And one thing I always appreciate that you do, Russell, is on Facebook, if you are putting your viewpoint out there or you're talking about a controversial subject, there's always a disclaimer right away where it's like, I'm not trying to offend anybody, like I'm genuinely trying to learn more about this issue. I think that goes a long way, disclaimers, because that also disarms people and allows them to kind of know the tone of what you're saying.
Right. Which, since you brought that up, that's a really important tool, and it's a very useful tool that I use. I wouldn't say in excess, because I don't really think there is really an excess of using that tool. I haven't found one yet. Maybe there is, and I'll learn that in the future. Maybe someone hearing this will tell me about it, and then I'll learn something, so I'm open to that. But so far, I haven't found an excess in using the tool of, basically, it's a variation of telling someone, this discussion is about ideas. It's not personal, so whatever I say about the idea is not something that I'm saying about you.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we've kind of talked about this too before, but it can get really tricky and hard when somebody's ideology does fundamentally connect with a lived experience. That lived experience may be like a traumatic experience or a deep injustice that has affected them personally and their family. So that's something that I'm still kind of trying to learn how to do. And I think that's one of like those, I think it can get really hard. And a lot of people nowadays are kind of skeptical that cordial conversations can really exist when you're talking about really high stakes topics. Because, a lot of people may say like, well, but you holding that ideology is a fundamentally like violent thing against me. And that's a question that I don't really necessarily have an answer to. But I think we will need to navigate that moving forward, especially just living in an age where things are becoming incredibly divisive. We just need to be really intentional about trying to find what connects us. Even if there are two ideologies that seem fundamentally incompatible, what connects those two individuals? Like that's going to be the key, I think, to navigating a lot of these really high stakes conversations.
What are some tools that you use personally to navigate conversations like that when you find yourself talking to someone who believes radically or thinks radically different than you do, and the radical differences have come up into the conversation and are now on the table?
That obviously happened a lot in college.
Right.
I had a lot of very close, who would become very close friends, but initially they wanted nothing to do with me because they understood me as someone who was, that's a religious person. And because of a lot of people's lived experiences, they connect people who are religious with very judgmental individuals. and it brings up personal traumas and experiences and things that they've had to go through. So that was hard. I mean, that's a tough thing to do.
So you had to overcome
And
that
honestly,
for them.
oh yeah, I mean, that was like the barrier before even introducing myself. Because for some reason, word traveled fast around my dorm that like I was a Christian. And I generally don't walk around with my faith on my sleeve. You know, I'm not like walking around thumping people's heads with a Bible or anything. And actually, I am very intentionally kind of low key about it because I do want to like try to build as much trust and give someone as much of an exposure to who I am before they kind of have that factor thrown in.
But people kind of got word and it got out and it was just out of your hands.
It got out, and yeah, and so like some people confronted me about it. I had to deal with some like hostile confrontations where like one, there was an experience. I was walking back to my dorm room and I was confronted by a group of guys who were drunk, and they were like a bunch of, you know, they were like sports guys, and they were like, hey, you know, we found out like you're a Christian. And they just started like throwing all these like really tough questions at me and kind of ridiculing me. It felt very much like something from like a, like some like really like poorly made Christian production. But it was very real. It was tough, but it was interesting because that was some of the first interactions I had with some of those guys. And I really just was like, I think I was ready for it because I was like, okay, this is going to happen. Like people have their assumptions. And so I tried my best to handle it well, where I was like, I didn't answer back, you know, in a hostile way. I was very trying to like understand what they were saying. And even if like I knew they weren't really wanting a constructive conversation, I was like doing my best to keep it that way.
Right.
And it was cool because actually, like the next day, one of them came up to me and apologized. And him and I became really, really good friends through college. And then the other two guys actually as well, they never really directly apologized about it initially, but we just started. I was just very persistent and almost like annoying about like engaging with them. And in this like a very like as much of a friendly way as I could. And then they ended up becoming good friends too. One of them, he became one of my closest friends through college. And it was cool. That kind of just happened to me, right? Like it's not like I like had a game plan, but I just make sure that I never react. I always respond, you know, like
But
I could react in fear.
you it sounds like you won them over by clearly demonstrating your humanity.
Yeah, exactly. I just knew, I was like, okay, people are going to have assumptions and like, there's no way to avoid that conflict. But my belief is like, if you are genuine in your pursuit of truth, you genuinely love other people behind closed doors. When I was in my room, not thinking like resentful thoughts towards them, like really genuinely hoping for that healthy connection, it kind of just shines through in your actions where you don't have to like think about it.
Yeah. And that's really interesting because it's very, very similar to a template to the experience that I had just in reverse flipped the other way on Facebook. Is because that was whole like, did I tag you in that post? My post that ended up getting like 200 comments or whatever. It's hidden now because too many other people started getting on it and trying to make it unproductive and it devolved. But it was good for a while. But anyway, like the whole accumulation of that happened because I had originally created a Facebook. I hadn't had a Facebook for years. And I didn't want a Facebook. I didn't want any social media. Not because I like hated social media. I just personally didn't have much of a use for it. Like if I wanted to stay in touch with someone, I'm the obnoxious person who will call you and leave a voicemail message. Like that's
I know the type.
Right. A little bit old school. So I didn't really need or want a social media, but because I knew that I was planning to produce a podcast, it's like I need a social media presence. It's like just part of the business venture. It's the name of the game. So I created one, and I'm not sure quite who it was, but somebody who knows me outed me as an atheist to someone who was like part of a church that I grew up with, and they freaked out and they like tagged me in some stuff and some other people in some stuff about it. And then everybody knew, and it just like exploded across Facebook. And it was like basically like your interaction of people confronting you about being a Christian, but like everybody on Facebook confronting me about being an atheist. It was just like the group and the dynamic was just like Facebook wide. Like 100 plus people of like all these people I used to go to church with. And it was quite the experience. And it was like, because it was Facebook, it was drawn out over like a 2-week period. Where just like every day I would wake up in the morning and I would just see like I would be tagged in all kinds of stuff. out of all these messages of people sending me all these prayers and all these questions and all these arguments and YouTube videos, and it was overwhelming. I had spent like 40 minutes in the beginning of the day just checking all the notifications, not even like responding. And I'd like most of it, I just responded of, sorry, I'm overwhelmed right now. I don't have time to deal with all this. And people would be like, oh, you don't want to meaningful engage and answer these questions? And I'll be like, I will get to you later. Some of them I'm still getting
Get in line.
Right,
Take a number.
Right. And that's why I ended up doing the thing where I like tagged everybody and stuff, is because I wasn't responding to everybody right away, and a lot of the conversation because of that started to devolve. People were tagging me and stuff, and they feel like I wasn't like responding to their arguments, watching the YouTube video that they sent me. So I'm sure a lot of people felt like I was being dismissive of them and wasn't engaging and wasn't answering their questions. And so it started to get increasingly hostile. And then there started to be rumors spread about me. I started to hear a lot of stuff that was just like patently false. Really got out of hand, and I like wasn't sure how to get a hold of the situation, and it was so many people involved that I just couldn't physically keep up. So it accumulated with me just taking all of the people who were being troublemakers and tagging them in a post, and then tagging a bunch of people who I knew were much more moderate and constructive. Because the thing is like when you're messaging someone or you're tagging them on your own wall, or you're tagging them in a different post that's on someone else's wall, that's like on a conservative page or like a Christian page or something, then that's radically different than engaging with that person on my wall or on their wall where like all their friends are present and there's a moderating presence. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that was kind of like I was trying to like pull it all together and then put them all in one place where whatever they said or did there would be a lot of eyes on them. And it was a little bit manipulative of me. Okay, it was very manipulative of me. But but I was kind of like, I was just going to funnel all of these people in the same place. And then I also tagged people like you, because I knew people like you would bring a much more constructive tame down, because I didn't want to feel like I was singling people out. I felt like if I just tagged the people who were being troublesome, that it would seem like an attack. And I didn't want it to seem like an attack. I wanted to start a dialogue and kind of shift the tone of the conversation to, I want to have a conversation. I want to talk about these things. I'm willing to ask these questions, and I'd love to hear your input. But I want to do it in a controlled way. And so then you got tagged in that Facebook post. And how'd you feel about that?
Yeah, no, that was cool. I really appreciated it. And like, you did a good job in your tone, because again, like when you say it, it's like the reason I'm, tagging you in is because I like respect your beliefs and your opinions. That right off the bat is just going to appeal to the ego in anybody.
Right.
Oh, well, I do know a thing or two about truth, whether you do or not.
Right.
But that was good. Like, I really appreciated when you did that, because I was like, oh, this is cool. And plus, like, I mean, I know you, I trust you. Maybe if it was someone else, I'd be a little more wary, but I thought that was really cool. And I didn't even I didn't know the whole story behind that. I'm sorry that happened to you. It sounded like you got jumped by a bunch of Christians.
Right. But you also got jumped by a bunch of like secular people. And the point of the post was to make it more of like, that's not a reflection on Christianity. I don't think it's fair to judge an ideology by the actions of some of its members, because if you're doing that, you're making an excuse. Those are the people who say, oh, well, people are rioting, so that means we don't acknowledge Black Lives Matter. It's like, no. That's not an engagement with the ideology or the philosophy behind it or the struggle of those people. It's an excuse to not engage. It's an excuse. You're looking at a behavior that you see as a problem, and because you see this behavior as a problem, you're not acknowledging the actual philosophy and arguments and points of the core of this issue. You're not really meaningfully engaging with the ideology. So I wouldn't think that it would be fair to look at that and be like, oh, like I think Christians are like bigots who are just trying to like attack me and gang up on me, because some people do that, and like your same response of just because some people responded to you in the way you did, you just got jumped in a different way. But that's not a reflection on the belief itself. That's just a reflection on the actions of the people who chose to make those actions.
No, exactly. I think you put it perfectly. And it's like, I walked away from that, from my own experience, it was like, wow, like all of us, like individually, we're carrying a lot more than even just like our ideology or our worldview, you know?
Right.
There are a lot of things and experiences that kind of dictate our behaviors. And the key is like really finding those people who you can connect well with. Because like, honestly, man, like there's some people who really just don't want to connect.
Right.
There's some people who just fundamentally are like, you're not going to get anywhere with them because they don't want to change their views. You know, like they're looking for the exit door in any kind of deeper conversation that might make them uncomfortable. And I'm speaking just from personal experience. Like that's the way I was, because it makes you feel vulnerable. You don't want to think about all the people in the world who hold completely different contrary ideas about the world than you. You want to just surround yourself with the familiar. And it's not like, I mean, I don't blame people because it's comfortable, but you got to find that balance. So surrounding yourself with support so you're not like always being challenged, because I think there's like a balance. You don't want to always be in more of an intense hostile environment.
Right.
Where like you're having to, you know, constantly be challenged, because we need to rest. Like we're designed to rest a lot. And, but you also don't want to surround yourself with people who are like-minded and don't press you to change or who don't challenge you. There's a balance to it.
Right. I think it's also really important and helpful for the people who, like you said, there are some people who won't be open-minded and won't change. And the response to that is not to react like them, because that puts you on their level and write them off. And it's a hard thing to do. It's such a hard thing to do. It requires a lot of character and discipline. But the right thing to do in that instance is to still make an effort to empathize and understand where they're coming from. It's even more important and critical that you extend them that courtesy of trying to empathize and understand where they're coming from. The people who were ganging up on me on Facebook, yes, I felt very attacked and ganged up on and overwhelmed in the moment. But I understand, like, individually where each one of them are coming from. Many of them, I'm sure, weren't aware of the actions of the other people. They were just personally trying to, like, reach out to me and start conversations and ask me hard questions in ways that they saw as meaningful, and their intentions were good. And I don't even think that necessarily even some of the lies that were circulating were necessarily intentional. I can't think of anybody. And it's possible that someone had really like negative, harsh, and ulterior motives to intentionally do that. But I don't know that for a fact. So because I don't know that for a fact, the best way in which I can benefit and move forward is to assume that these were unintentional and that they came about through other things. Because when a bunch of people are back and forth on Facebook over the period of 2 weeks, like anything can happen. It's so important to extend to the other person the opportunity to try to understand where they're coming from and say, okay, they probably don't intend to attack me. They probably don't intend to gang up on me. They probably don't intend to overwhelm, and they probably don't intend to like come across as harsh or attacking or condescending. So extend the courtesy of, I'm going to assume until proven otherwise. You're a lawyer. It's innocent until proven guilty, not guilty until proven innocent. But we tend to, in the courtroom, we say innocent until proven guilty. But in the courtroom of our lives, we tend to assume people are guilty until they demonstrate that they're innocent. But like, how unfair is that to say just because you're hurt or if you feel attacked to assume that they're guilty until they demonstrate that they're innocent, instead of trying to interpret their actions in a more charitable way. And if you do interpret someone's actions in a more charitable way, yes, sometimes you'll be wrong. Sometimes people do genuinely have bad motives. But most of the time, when you do that, you will find that, like you did, when you interpreted their actions in a charitable way, it provided them the opportunity to see you differently and become your friends. And now you've had great friendships that benefited from that because you took the effort to extend them the charity of interpreting their actions generously and being open-minded to where they were coming from. And because you did that, so much value has come in your life from that.
Yeah, true. And like having like you were saying, I love the legal jargon.
Of course you would.
It's actually really helpful because the presumption of innocence, and I found it's easier for me to have that mindset the more I become in tune with my own brokenness, and like my own flawed ways of thinking. Kind of almost to like bring it back to even like the clarity from like solitude and meditation, just like understanding what's going through my mind. Because even if I do have like a toxic interaction or experience with someone where I feel wronged, because I'm so aware of my own shortcomings and my own brokenness, it gives me like that initial understanding of like, okay, like I think they're coming from this place, or like maybe they were hurt in the past, or
Right.
maybe they experienced the same thing. And so they haven't been able to process it, and so they're projecting it on me. It makes it a little easier because it is hard to turn the other cheek per se, because, just instinctively you want to defend yourself and right the wrong that you're experiencing. But it takes you a lot further when you can try to see yourself in the other person, because I may need that same grace one day. Do something really hurtful to someone unintentionally, and I sure hope that that person has the same approach to me.
Right, absolutely. You talked about in an instance when you hurt someone, I hope they extend you the courtesy. You have to be able to examine your own actions and ask, did I do things that were unconstructive? Like, was I part of the problem? To beat the dead horse of talking about the Facebook post, in that instance, like in hindsight, it's very easy for me to see instances in which the way I responded pushed people to this. Like, I didn't de-escalate this. I tried to like not escalate it, but my way of trying not to escalate it was just trying to manage everybody and calm the situation down and not really like engage with people right away. And so because of that, a lot of people felt, I'm sure, dismissed and not acknowledged, and like I wasn't engaging with them, because I wasn't. I was just trying to like de-escalate the situation, but I wasn't really engaging with them. And so because of that, in hindsight, it's very easy to see how it escalated to where it did, because I wasn't taking a breath in each moment to think about, okay, how do I need to respond to this person to really interact with the fear or the concern or the situation that they're trying to address, instead of just trying to make the situation go away. Because I was reacting in a way of like, how do I make this situation go away? I don't look back and say that there was too many things that I necessarily specifically did wrong. But even if you didn't do something wrong, though there's many times in which I've specifically done things that are wrong, but even if you don't specifically do something wrong, that doesn't mean that you didn't contribute to a situation or contribute to people reacting the way they did. While extending other people charity, it's also important to self-examine and ask yourself, what did I do to contribute to this situation? And that doesn't make you at fault, and that's never an excuse to like victim blame for a situation. If you take that too far, that can become a very dangerous situation of where people blame the victim. Oh, you contributed this situation. You put yourself in this situation. That makes you at fault. No, it doesn't make you at fault. But at the same time, you can't completely brush aside your own individual agency and your personal responsibility for your choices. That doesn't make you at fault for the instance that happened. But to not acknowledge your own agency and your own choices is to take away all of your power to be in control of your life and make yourself just a victim.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And I think the ownership of our own mistakes is so huge, because it does put you in a posture to where you can kind of demonstrate that understanding.
Right.
I think that the more you identify with the brokenness in someone else, especially the person who hurt you, that in my own life has been the most healing thing for myself. Because then when I go back to that moment or that experience where it was maybe a toxic interaction or I was hurt, it empowers me to not only show that grace in that moment, but also have grace for myself. Because a lot of times it triggers the guilt, because we maybe identify with the perpetrator, or like we maybe think like, oh wow, I've done something similar to somebody else. But when there's that ownership where it's like, you know what, this person hurt me, or, we had this interaction and I seem to be having a lot of toxic interactions with people of like this particular group or something, it guides you on your own pursuit of truth. A whole part about discovering truth isn't even about what's out there. A lot of it is just about how we respond to the situations that we're put in. That's really like what we're all looking for. Like when we wrestle with these big ideas about meaning and truth, a lot of times we're searching for questions that are very personal and like very sensitive.
Yeah.
So it's really important if you're going to engage in that way.
We have spanned quite the gorge here.
We have.
All right. Do you have any closing thoughts?
I really do appreciate you inviting me onto the podcast. And I will just say, even just walking away from this conversation, it's given me a lot of clarity, and also just it's encouraging for me, because I think that productive, mutually beneficial conversation between people with completely different worldviews and ideologies and beliefs are possible, as this conversation demonstrated. But even more than that, it gives me hope, because if we're going to learn just as a generation how to communicate and how to share really sensitive, personal, intimate stories that have informed our worldviews, we're going to have to do it with friendship.
Right.
So that's why, I appreciate your friendship, and it gives me hope moving forward.
Thank you. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast, and you're my friend because you're one of the most level-headed and mature people that I know.
Wow. I don't know what to say to that. That's an incredibly flattering thing.
Thank you very much for joining us. I've been your host, Russell Eugene Welch III. Our guest has been Caleb. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll find you next week. Thank you for joining me. This has been The Struggle for Meaning with Russell Eugene Welch III as your host. That's me. If you have enjoyed this program, please share it with someone else and leave a 5-star review to help us grow. If you go to lingeringshadow.com, you can find my blog, social media, updates on all my current projects, and announcements for future ones. I post all kinds of stuff on there every day. We always have an ongoing conversation about personal growth and finding meaning there. So hop on over and let's hear your thoughts too. Again, that's lingeringshadow.com. Keep learning, keep growing, and take it all one day at a time. You got this. Remember, you are not alone. We all live life together, so let's share life together. Now, here is a moment for yourself to just breathe and feel alive. Take care.